we are here at SDHistCon, and my name is Liz Davidson. I run a channel called Beyond Solitaire, and I am actually here to replace Fred Serple. There was a very unfortunate coup in his Discord. I am the victor, and I'm him now. So now I will be running this Undaunted chat. We are here with basically all the great luminaries of the Undaunted series. I'm super excited to see all of you together. This series has been a big deal for all of us who like war games and light games and nasty, aggressive little two-player games that are also just really thinky. So this has been awesome. So I'm going to run through all of you and just let you introduce yourselves quickly and say who you are, and then we'll just have some chat. So why don't we start with the designers? Trevor, you were here. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Trevor Benjamin. I am, as listed. Hi, everybody. I'm one of the designers of the game. I'd say I'm the second designer of the game, which is, David's the big boy. I'm just his sidekick.
I don't know about that, but David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry, I was saying that's definitely not true. Trevor's the one that makes good games. I just make games. I make lots of games and he makes lots of good games. That's our relationship. But yeah, the other designer.
And then we've got Roland MacDonald, the artist. Why don't you say a couple words, Roland?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I've been the artist on the series, and it's been a great ride. So looking forward to sharing any input I can to the listeners today.
Fantastic. We have Emily Neat, who is a marketing lead for Osprey, and you've had a lot to do with this game from its inception. So tell us the quick version of your relationship with this game.
Yeah, no, I'm head of marketing at Osprey Games. Worked on all of the Undaunteds gratefully since we commissioned them back in, I'm sure Duncan will correct me, but 2016, 2017. So yeah, really excited to look back at everything that we've done so far.
Fantastic. We have David Digby, solo developer. So tell us a little bit about yourself, David.
Hello, yeah, I'm David Digby. I did along with Mr. Tertsy, I did the solo design for the Undaunted Reinforcements set.
Fantastic. We have Rhys Ap Gwyn, the current developer. So how you doing, Rhys? Tell us a little bit about your role in the game.
Yeah, hello. I'm a game developer at Osprey. I sort of joined a little bit late into the series development. So I came in just after Stalingrad sort of shipped out.
Excellent. And then we also have the OG developer of this game, the person who first signed Undaunted, Duncan Molloy. How you doing, Duncan? Tell us a little bit about your role in the game.
Yeah, so I was the kind of head of the board game line at Osprey when we first published Undaunted, and initially responsible for the mistake of turning it down, which turned out maybe to be not the mistake, and then the very correct decision of publishing it. So yeah, and then kind of commissioned the subsequent post-Normandy series, but had left Osprey by the time they were taken into development.
Fantastic. And actually, I ended with you because I thought that this might be sort of a fun first thing to ask. So if I understand correctly, your original meeting at Osprey to talk about Undaunted was at Spiel 2014. And then years later, things came back together. So why didn't Undaunted take off the first time? And then why did you end up wanting to see it again when it circled back?
In the knowledge that this is being recorded, and with the caveat that all of my information is about 8 years old, and it's been a long 8 years. I think initially David pitched what was then Platoon Command. And correct me if I'm wrong, David, that you haven't brought Trevor in yet at that point?
Right, that's right.
At the time, we hadn't quite landed on what the tone of the board game line was at Osprey yet. So we had kind of a lot of potential. I think if it was our first Essen, we would have released King is Dead and a couple of other titles. I was very happy with the direction we were developing in, but Osprey was still very much known for military history more than for board games and the kind of pseudo Eurogame design that it moved into. And I really, really liked Platoon Command. And I was really, really, frankly, looking at it going, it felt like it needed something, but not very much. But I didn't have the capacity to give it the something that it needed at that moment. So I, as I recall, and genuinely, please correct me if I'm wrong here, David, I kind of gave it a it's not you, it's me. And some kind of feedback on, again, in the knowledge this is about 8 years out of date, the feeling that I loved the core mechanic, but that I think it needed more diversity in the scenarios. Does that feel accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the core was largely, it has largely been the same, right? And Trevor can talk a little bit about what the impact he really had on the game. But there were no scenarios when I pitched it, right? There was essentially, just kind of throw some pieces on the board and go at it with the intent that, like, probably add something. But yeah, I think that was definitely, like, it needed a lot of development is the easiest way to say it. And this was, I had never had a published game at the time, right? So this was me coming to you with a design that was essentially sort of, that there was some design kernel there, but it needed a lot of it.
And that's not to minimize how good the core is, right? Really, the core is good enough to have driven however many releases it is at this stage, 5 or 6 hugely successful titles. Like the engine was pure, but at that time I was struggling to keep my head above water, to be frank. And the hope was that David would come back to me with a subsequent version of it. And when another publisher subsequently picked it up, I was both happy for him and a little bit heartbroken, I think it's fair to say. But then circumstances being what they are in the board game industry, we had the opportunity to pick it up again. And at that point, they brought Trevor on. And we brought, I think at that stage, had Philip joined Osprey at that stage, Emily, can you remember?
Yeah.
And, there was a bigger team to be able to kind of take advantage of its potential at that point. And we really just hit the ground running quite quickly with what David and Trevor brought in the second time around. What we ended up publishing was very close to what was directly pitched at that point.
And then I'm now also under the impression that this was not originally called Undaunted. I think, Emily, you might have some good answers about that. How did we arrive at this name, which is now so commonplace, but it was originally called Platoon something that I can't remember now from like 5 minutes ago?
Yeah, I actually had quite a lot of fun. Not brilliant at deleting emails, so I had quite a lot of fun looking back to 2018, looking through to see all the different titles that we had, and there were a lot of different options. It's quite crazy to think that it could have ever been called anything other than Undaunted. But I sent across the other day just some samples from Sons of Mars. Charge was on there. What else do we have? Foot Soldier, Scout. Lots and lots of options that we then kind of whittled down. I think I'm sure David's probably better place to talk about this, but like Undaunted was the one that we kept coming back to. We got lots of rounds of discussion, but the fact that there was so much meaning in Undaunted and the connections to the history of the game, one that of course David knows better than I do, but it had that kind of backing behind it that felt so rich. And looking back on it, it's crazy to think we could have gone for any of the others, although there's some really strong titles in there, but it's who can imagine anything else now beyond Undaunted?
Yeah, as I recall at the time, the retitling of the game was the biggest point of contention internally. There was no question of like, this is good and we should publish it, but there was like a long protracted argument is too strong a word, but a long protracted conversation about like which of these many possible titles should we go with. And
it's funny actually, I had a look through the covers because we do a circulation of covers when we're looking at what we're going to call it, what's that going to look like. And Roland's amazing artwork is the linchpin of that. And actually, we played around with some font once we kind of fixed on Undaunted, but it was never going to look very different, actually, because that artwork was just like the forefront of what it was. And it was different fonts and, placements of logos. But I think when we had it, we knew it, and we knew that Undaunted was the right fit for it.
That's fantastic. And actually, that leads into something I did want to ask, which is, Undaunted has a really specific look to it, a very specific aesthetic. And Roland, how did you arrive at that aesthetic? What did you try that didn't work, or did you know right away? How did you get to Undaunted as we see it today?
I think Duncan is probably the person who brought me on from. I just finished the first Western Legends game, which was in a similar style. It's got like a just very loose ink and watercolor kind of effect. And I think, I don't know, I'm not going to speak for Duncan, but I think what's good about that as a fit, like totally basing why I think Duncan chose it, is that it's got a lot of life and energy in it. It can move, and yet it's got fluidity, so the people feel alive. It feels like there's potential, but it's not so grounded, like feeling like very authentic historical locked down to something. It's got potential to be things, and it's got potential to live and move. And I think that's one of the things that has made it really successful, is I think people can place a bit of their own imagination into the characters because there's still enough space there for you to layer stuff in. And yet the looseness and the brightness and the energy in the drawings means that they don't feel like static illustrations. They feel like there's potential. You've just caught a frame as they're whipping by to do something. And I think that's really important for the whole system, really. But yeah, I didn't, in terms of trying stuff, the style was kind of there. I think the refinements that were done for Undaunted largely just came out of the theme, really, just what fitted better. So adjustments to color, adjustments for brushes for me and things, but they were really just modulations on a style that Duncan had already spotted as a good fit for the games.
Yeah, I don't want to like necessarily take all the credit for that, because Philip Hartelius, who isn't part of this call, but who subsequently replaced me at as the kind of head of the board game line at Osprey, he and I would have had quite a lot of back and forth on it. But I think part of the reason Roland is a really good fit for Undaunted specifically is because there's a real period appropriateness to Roland's, to that particular style of Roland's artwork, without it necessarily feeling old-fashioned. And I think the thing that in the same way that Undaunted felt like it was kind of classic wargaming in a way that felt really fresh and really modern, or almost kind of timeless, the particular style of Roland's that I had, because I'd seen different parts of Roland's art, but I particularly liked his work on Western Legends. It felt like it met that challenge of being not inappropriate for the theme or the tone or the kind of level of historical accuracy that David and Trevor were going for, but equally not of the past, you know?
Yeah, and actually, I also had a question for Roland. You know, Roland, I noticed one thing that's very cool about Undaunted is that a lot of the scenarios are based on historical events and do bring in real terrain. And I've not played Undaunted Stalingrad yet, but I've noticed lots of comments on kind of the accuracy of the maps that appear in the tiles. How do you blend what you need to happen artistically in the game with the elements of realism that make it in?
It's changed a lot for each different scenario, really. The first two, North Africa and Normandy, are, because they're much more modular in the system, then it was just developing some tiles that have tiling texture and the right kind of buildings that build an environment and can be used in multiple different ways. Stalingrad is an entirely different prospect because it's a fixed place that expands across a city. When I got the original maps from David, then I talked to him a bit and the publishers, Philip specifically, about how accurate we were going to be with it. I did tons of research because I really wanted, even though it needs to work mostly for a gameplay point of view, and there are exceptions and concessions that have been made to make it work as a game system, I wanted to be able to put in as much of the real streets and the real layout as possible and match the buildings as closely as possible in shapes and feel. It's tricky. There's not a huge amount of reference of Stalingrad pre, but yeah, there was a lot out there. And actually the gameplay and the world come together very much. And in the other scenarios, it's much more like a abstracted game mechanism that happens to, obviously the scenarios are based on real places and things, but the modular system just enables you to build what you need. Whereas Stalingrad is very precise.
Yeah, I feel like this game has been through a whole lot of, evolutions over the years. Like the system has a sense of similarity from game to game, but it's quite clear that y'all are building a lot. And part of that is that there's so many different designers involved now. So Trevor, it sounds like you, and I'm sure people know the story, but I actually don't. So how did you end up on this project with David? And what was the early part of y'all's partnership like? And then I want to talk to developers after this.
So I was brought in after David had pitched to Duncan, right? So David came to me, and we were both very, very early in our design careers. We had joined a sort of a design meetup group, and we knew each other a bit, but we hadn't actually started working on anything together yet. David said, I've got this game, there's a publisher who's interested, I need to build it out, do a bunch of scenario development. So that's how I started, basically, was working with David to do scenario development for what was then Platoon Command, as well as do some polish, take out some little fuzzy, messy bits. No offense to David, but he would admit as much too. So that's how it started. Was at that point, and then we basically built out a bunch of scenarios, polished it up, and as Duncan mentioned, there was another publisher interested at that point. It went to them, and then it didn't come to light, and then we threw it back at Duncan and Philip at that point, and they were keen to keep going with it. And then since then, it's been the relationship that David and I built out of developing this game has changed quite a bit over the years. I mean, now it's, we still have our roles within it. Like, he's 100% the history guy. I do my due diligence. I do a bit of reading, but it's that's not really my shtick. And so that's, I'm much more. David obviously is interested in the gameplay and the product and those sorts of things too, of course. But it's very much that's the role that I take is on sort of tuning and tweaking and designing the system and building out the scenarios with David.
And David, how do you choose your design partners? Like, I know that you make mistakes from personal experience with this, but not with Undaunted. So, from your perspective, like, what goes into choosing a design partner?
And it's a little bit different because at the time, like we talked about, I was still very early in my sort of design, career, whatever you want to call it. So Trevor and I were meeting frequently in Cambridge as part of a design collective or group or whatever. And so we were both kind of the new guys, there. And so but we also got along naturally pretty well. Though it is interesting that like some of the sharpest bits that you would say that remained in Undaunted were probably because Trevor and I didn't know each other as well as we do now. And so, there might have been not as much pushback in Trevor telling me how bad I am at design and fixing all my problems as he does nowadays. But yeah, it's definitely a relationship first and then a design partnership second. That's how kind of I approach my design partnerships. So yeah, we've gotten to know each other super well. Certainly he's my closest design partner, but I'm very careful, about entering any kind of design relationship now with anybody, just based on what I've learned over.
So I also don't want to talk to the developers. So Duncan, you were the sort of first developer for Undaunted as well. Is that correct? And then what kind of
yes, that's correct.
What goes into developing a game that we might not think about as opposed to designing, especially for one like this?
It is, what, on any other title, I would have a long and protracted answer for this one. But I think in this particular one, the real thing that I added to the Undaunted series more than anything else is making Trevor and David commit to at least 2 more titles in the series before I would sign it. At which point it was just originally a single game, and I went, right, guys, this is good enough to publish, but I want 2 more. And that was, a lot easier for me to demand of them than it was to action. But I think in this particular case, because I had, we'd agreed that the next one I think would be North Africa, but I hadn't actually seen a draft of it by the time I left Osprey. Actually, I think David and Rhys might be better placed to answer this question than I am on this particular series, reluctant as I am to give up the spotlight.
And then, you know, Rhys, you're the current developer for Undaunted. So when you came on the project, what made you excited to do it? And then in what ways have you pushed the series in kind of your own direction and brought a bit of your own sensibilities to its development?
In terms of excitement, I mean, it's such a great core game, right? That anything we do with it is sort of already really great. And so looking at anything in any direction is exciting already. In terms of bringing stuff, lots of my role is sort of about the future of Undaunted. And so I can't talk about too much stuff apart from hearing sort of fan calls for certain things and hopefully implementing some of those into future titles.
And then David Digby, I know that you are the primary solo developer for this game. So how did you kind of graft on to this already like large existing infrastructure and then bring some solo sensibilities to that reinforcements expansion?
I think the team, Philip, Anthony, David, Trevor, had been in touch with Mr. Turtsey about doing the solo content for it. David had sketched out a sort of an overarching, this is roughly how I think it should work. This is a good solo system, but needed someone on board to then play the, what did we end up with? Is it 20, 23, 28, something like that, scenarios, and work on the nuances. Obviously, before reinforcements came out, there was existing fan-made solo content. There was the possibility of playing two-handed. And I think one of the key things that was identified in my brief was to make sure that the scenarios played out in the right way with the right feels. So it was getting to know the scenarios and then building both sides of the scenarios in terms of the bot behaviors that then gave you that play experience so that the scenarios felt like the way that they should. That was kind of the major undertaking, and I lulled my sense into a bit of false sense of security with Normandy, which we breezed through quite quickly, and then North Africa presented a whole realm of challenges because of the nature of the asymmetry in that and the scale of it, which David and Trevor can talk about more, but the individual units rather than a sort of set of troops presented me with a lot more challenges. And that's why you see in the reinforcements content, you'll see the massive difference between the amount of content there is for North Africa compared to Normandy, just because of all those little edge cases and nuances that needed including in the design work there.
So this may be a question that actually is mostly for you, Emily, but I think everybody would have something to say on it, which is, so Undaunted first came out at a time when I think that we were not quite as enthused yet about kind of waros and war games that are hybridized with other gaming mechanisms. Like, I feel like Undaunted is an early part of that movement. And since then, I feel like I've seen a lot of changes in historical games and the kinds of ways of expressing history in games that we're willing to look at and accept. But what was the initial reception of Undaunted in playtesting, and how did you make marketing decisions about it? Because it was like a war game and also kind of not.
It's a really interesting question, because I think Osprey Games has this sort of pedigree of wargaming, you know, that already existed, those kind of typical miniatures games. And this kind of, you know, as Duncan mentioned, it kind of grew out of that. So we had that kind of established core audience. But then Undaunted does something so different and helps us to kind of stretch into those kind of board game communities. And, you know, it was a kind of an accessible approach to something that some people maybe hadn't explored already. And that was the core of what we were trying to do. Certainly from its outset, I was saying, I remember sort of taking a sort of hand-built prototype of it to Gamma and sort of smuggling in a little The King is Dead first edition box, and it was just sort of packed in my suitcase. And I think we knew then actually how much it was going to light people up. We did one of the PSI game nights, and we got people playing it, and suddenly it was really hooky, and people were sort of, oh, I want to play another game. And we knew from that stage that we had something that was kind of just pushing what we'd done beyond those kind of wargaming, sort of strict wargaming games that we already produced. So then it was about, well, how do we make sure it gets to those people? How do they, how are they aware of it? We demoed it at Gen Con in 2019, if memory serves. And we had David kind of came on stand and demoed it with us, and the stand was full, it was packed, it was brilliant to see people engaged. And that continued over the next sort of 6 months. And then Shut 'Em and Sit Down featured it in one of their videos in January 2020, I think. And suddenly just everything exploded, and it got eyes on the game that maybe hadn't been on their radars, because the theme might have, the military history part of it or the war game element might have picked people off. And then suddenly they're going, actually, it's got this really strong deck building element to it that is really, it's sort of captured people's imaginations. And it just kind of went mad from there, really. And it was about accepting the fact that there are so many different communities that this game actually reaches. And I think that's continued all the way through. It's been lovely to see such a huge community like build up and have such a fascination and appetite for it.
Anyone else? I know that we've all been on this.
If you don't mind me jumping in at this point, I think one of the real successes of Undaunted as a series, which is down to like a combination of like Roland and David and Trevor and Emily and her team, is tone, right? It's that it was one of an early wave of war games where simulation wasn't just about stats, but rather about atmosphere, about tone, and about lived experience. And I think there's something in, not to put words in your mouth, David, but I think there's something in David's experience of his, understanding of like military precision and military actions and military supply lines, married with like, this is the story of my granddad, and that 1-2 punch of the sense that the precision of simulation needs to go beyond, tanks and army units and chains of command, and rather into the lived, not to over-aggrandize what is like a really good card-driven board game, like, don't get me wrong, but like the lived experience of a soldier on the ground is different to the strict simulationist kind of strategic level experience of like, well, if X had happened here, then alternate history might be Y. Like, to be able to marry the simulationist aspect of stats on units with the simulationist aspect of how much it hurts when somebody gets shot is the real heart of the game. And if it didn't have such good core, such a flexible kind of mechanical engine underpinning all of that, then the marrying of those two arguably wouldn't have mattered. But in a world where it does have that, it just elevates it to something more than the sum of its parts, I think, at least on a personal level.
One thing to sort of piggyback on what Duncan and Emily are saying is that, when you think of the job of like Duncan's position there, especially sort of leading the games, and people talk about developers, you often think about development is refining the game design. But really, I think what made Undaunted successful is the entire sort of production of the package as a whole. Because if Undaunted didn't have Roland's art, it almost certainly, like that conveyance, it almost certainly would not have been nearly as popular. And then when you had the attention to detail that Duncan and Philip brought to it, so like each soldier having his own individual art and each soldier having their own name, right? Those are additions that was led by Duncan and of course Roland's art. So those decisions, I think, were critical in making, sort of carrying through that line that Duncan's personal.
I think that's true. I think it just that it's the scale, isn't it, and the humanity of it, that the mechanic for a card dying, but then developers' sense of making that card. How can we make that card feel more and more like a person than just one person? Well, we can give it every character an individual face, and we can give every character an individual name. Okay, now we've got a whole different amount of weight to those small deaths that mean so much. And as we move into Stalingrad, the scale of that has just grown across the series. So that's been, and the production value of the game is fantastic. So I think also the graphic design, I don't know who specifically at Osprey does the graphic design, but it's just
Steve Maioraso was originally Roland. Steve Maioraso was the guy who did the original graphic design for the series. And correct me if I'm wrong, Emily, I believe his graphic design has been kept across the rest of the series.
Yeah, it's just the same throughout. It's just so clean and so tight, and I think that makes it so accessible. So many deck builders have too much text, too much noise, and this is just very precise, and it enables you to just get on with the game, you know, and that is so important. I think it's just for a game design, game interaction perspective, everything about this just lets you get on with it as well.
So here's sort of a question for all of you then. So if, we have this emphasis on sort of elegance, on individuals coming out in the card art, in having good bones that get kind of redeployed in different forms across multiple releases, how do you balance between kind of keeping the soul of Undaunted intact and also adding on continuously new things? So Undaunted Stalingrad has been quite its own thing. I know that Battle of Britain is going to have the first kind of air combat elements that have existed in Undaunted. How do you keep it fresh while also keeping it consistent?
It's something that Trevor and I definitely talk about when we started.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I mean, that's certainly the challenge for any game, right? With any game that has a long, a series of releases. Is how do you, because obviously people with every new game want to play Undaunted, right? That's why they're buying the game. So it's really a tricky question. I mean, certainly, I guess from Dave and I's perspective is we've said this before, we want, just for our own, sake, to stretch things and pull things in different ways with each new game, right? So, it would be very easy for us to just say, pick another theater and essentially, just simply redo what we've done before. But we've always wanted to stretch and pull things. So I think that's when we come to each new title, that's the first thing we're thinking is like, what are a few key things which we can bring which really pull it in a different direction. I mean, I think, so with North Africa, we introduced asymmetry and then the zoomed in scale. And we intended it to be quite a bit more, cinematic than the Normandy, like the feeling of individuals running around jumping into vehicles and with reinforcements. Obviously, the key was to bring in, the solo play, the 4-player, and then just add a few bells and whistles. And then with Stalingrad, it was this massive epic thing. But we've always. I just one other thing I want to highlight is that along the way, we've learned many, many things. And so we've been, as well as making these big grand changes, we've been like playing around with core elements of the game, like particular rules. We've tried to hone things down. We've also tried to get, and I think we're doing a good job of this, of getting better of presenting the game, like thinking about, what's your first experience with this game and layering in the complexity at the correct rate, right? We want to bring, we want to make sure that the first scenario is a good introduction to what that new game is. And that's quite a tricky balance, especially when we've got every time we make a new game, because we're typically doing standalone boxes rather than expansions. We have to keep the first scenario something that an entirely first-time player can play, but also someone who's a veteran and has played, all of the scenarios in all the boxes before can still find something and that's a really tricky balance. And yes, I mean that's it's and again it's a tricky question. I mean I don't really know. It's a lot of it is about feel. We know that the core experience is, it's a question of how far can you stretch it and still feeling like it is Undaunted. I've spoken enough. I think that's what I've got to say. What do you think, David?
Well, the only thing I'll add, I agree with everything you said. The only thing I'll add is I remember, so it wasn't, the evolution of Normandy to North Africa to reinforcements to Stalingrad, that was largely a fairly natural transition, right? The radical difference, the radical change was going to Battle of Britain. And I distinctly remember Trevor and I having many conversations as we were designing that game and developing those scenarios saying, does this feel like Undaunted, right? Like, are we going too far astray, right? And that was we had to constantly check in with ourselves on that.
And then I guess this is sort of a question for David Digby and the rest of you. So, since reinforcements came out, I know that there's no solo for Stalingrad, right? But reinforcements introduced multiplayer and solo. And, is there going to be any more of that? Or is that just sort of like a blip in the evolution of Undaunted, and it will just sort of continue to be mostly a 2-player event?
I'm going to defer to Rhys.
Yeah, sure. I suppose we can say that we know that people are interested in more team play and solo play and are definitely considering that for future titles.
Can I add one thing about this real quick? I think it's important for people that might not know that, first of all, I will say this, working with Osprey is working with a fine-oiled machine, right? So when Duncan passed the baton to Philip and Philip passed it to Anthony and Anthony's now passed it to Rhys, they keep Trevor and me on schedule. Like, it is a fine-oiled machine. And what that means is that we're working on games 2 iterations ahead of time, right before the game's released. And so when we were working on, for sure, Stalingrad was being tied up, or maybe Battle of Britain was already in work before reinforcements came out. So when people are like, why doesn't Stalingrad have solo? Or why doesn't Battle of Britain have solo? It's like, well, the solo system hadn't even been developed yet. So it's because I think people feel like, the designers or the publishers not listening to the demands of the people. But it's like, well, it takes a while to kind of turn the ship and integrate what people are interested in.
I mean, we love it every single time, David. Like, every time a new box comes out, it's like the first or second comment is like, "Is there a solo? Can you put in a solo?" And it's like, by the time you've seen the picture, on Board Game Geek or on Twitter or whatever, it's like, it's already like printed. So it's far too late at that point. But we certainly hear people now, and this is something that we are, thinking about for the future for sure.
Yeah, to back up David and Trevor on that front, like the Stalingrad came out, what was it, last September? And in prep for this conversation, because my memory is lumpy soup at this point, I was looking back through old notes that I had and found mine and Philip's initial set of Undaunted Legacy notes, which date from August in 2018. So to give you guys a sense of like, that is both a sense of how confident we were that Undaunted had legs, right? And also a sense of that the nature of board games is that you want to respond to player feedback, but that necessarily that feedback is reflexive and staggered, that the things we are learning and the things players are learning are on 2 different timelines. And every new thing we learn about the game, we kind of implement in the next title, and every new thing the players teach us about the game, we implement in like 3 or 4 titles time.
I think there's actually something lovely that you refer to, that kind of what they teach us. And it has been so lovely to watch that kind of board game geek community kind of specifically very vocally putting out, their own sort of fan-made scenarios, asking questions, really, really engaging with it in a way that, okay, yeah, sure, we're working on them quite far ahead. And if you're seeing them, as you've said already, they're already made. But it's so great to have a series that feels shaped by that community as well. And I hope that we continue to do that, because it's such a meaningful, you have conversations, go to conventions finally but we're meeting people who have kind of talked about something. Oh, I wanted this. I mentioned this like 3 years ago. I wanted to see this. And now it's here. And it's like, yeah, that's really rewarding to see as well.
That's fantastic. I'm going to take a question because poor Arthur has asked us twice. I saw the first time, man, I promise. So he asked, David, given the specific instance of pitching Undaunted as your first game, would you give any advice for as yet unpublished designers? So basically, this is one of your early pitches. What would you change? A thing or two. And then Duncan, any advice from the publisher's side?
I would just say work on something that you're really passionate. That's all I would say. Just work on it for all the love and that you have into the project, and then look for a publisher. But it's not like if you're trying to sell a game for the sake of selling a game or whatever. I think that's the right. I would just say work on something that's really, really passionate, and then try to find a publisher that makes sense.
It's so hard to know, because I was so new to being a publisher, and David was so new to being a designer, and I have a distinct memory in the same year that David kind of cold approached us at Essen one year, and at the previous UK Games Expo, Helen Ruth had cold approached me with Cryptid. While I couldn't more strongly disencourage cold approaches to publishers at game shows, the Undaunted series and Spill the Ars nominee came out of it. It is difficult for me to talk about it with any kind of authority, because the game community now, as it exists, is already so different to what it was like 6-8 years ago. And it's already so much bigger and noisier, and there's so much more competition for volume, I suppose. And I really wouldn't envy anybody who is starting out within that, beyond to say that the things that both of those games had in common, I think, is that they had designers that were really, really passionate about their particular thing, and were coming at it from an angle not of wanting to have published a game, but rather from loving games and having something that they wanted to express in a particular title. And I realize that can sound very kind of vague, for want of a better word, but if we're going to treat games as kind of like a literature form or an art form or whatever it is, which I think we're at the point of, and I think we should. It's perfectly okay to have art that just makes people happy, but it needs to still be your art. It needs to be something that you are driven by, not because you want to have created something, but because there's something in the individual thing that you're creating that you feel a little fire inside you as a result of. And I think it's equally, even as I'm saying that, it is you are no less a designer if your games are unpublished than if your games are published and hugely successful. But I think on a personal level, I think the thing that stood out for me for those two pitches, and again, I can only speak on a personal level for the circumstances at the time, was that these were games that were driven by the passion of the individuals for those games, rather than the passion of the individuals to work in the game industry.
So, Duncan, you accidentally walked into, this was a carefully laid trap. No kidding. The last big question that I wanted to ask, which is, it's very clear that Undaunted has a pretty strong artistic vision. And in fact, y'all make a lot of decisions that sometimes get a little bit of blowback. So I really liked having female snipers in Stalingrad. Or having a representation of multiple races among soldiers in other editions of the game. And so, and you always get but history, but this, but that. You have to make artistic decisions as you go. You have to make design decisions as you go. And it's this whole team. So how do you all get input and feel ownership in an outfit that is this large and that has been handed from person to person? And if you do have a disagreement, how do you resolve it?
Rhys is in charge now. I do what Rhys says.
Oh, Mr. Quiet there. So Rhys has just been messaging everybody quietly throughout this, bossing us around. Okay, I got it.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, I think we're always trying to be as inclusive and in different ways as we possibly can be. Yeah, which hopefully as an industry we're moving forward in as well.
I think it's quite interesting talking about the idea of like how you come to these decisions, and the kind of behind the scenes bit is really interesting. We're very fortunate that although if it sort of feels like a big company that we work in, but actually we're all largely in one office, largely based out of Oxford, and we can have discussion points and we can go back and forth. And I think having that really nice connection between all of us, we see these games at prototype and we see them going through, and we can have a real conversation about what we want it to be. I think diversity is a really interesting point, something that's been very important throughout the whole series and something that we've always backed. There was never a point of contention from our side, but there have been lots of little things where you're discussing, when we put something out, how do you attach it to a different show, which is the next one to do right now? Why aren't we doing solo? All those little things are, great to have a conversation in a space to do that. And from my perspective, at least, it works because of that kind of close connectivity with everybody.
The view that history is largely white mostly came from the Victorians, and like a lot of modern history is the unlearning of a lot of older history. And I think that is something that I've always kept in the back of my mind, that, diversity and historical accuracy are not mutually exclusive, and anybody who tells you otherwise kind of has an agenda, whether or not they realize it. But even beyond that, in a lot of specific decisions, specifically around Undaunted Normandy, I know there were questions about, African American troops wouldn't have been in these particular engagements and so on and so forth, and there was such a high level of historical accuracy in some regards that the anticipation of the question existed, even though there was no real question for us that we wanted to represent the feel of a kind of battlefield as a whole. So for us, or at least for me personally, when I would have been having conversations with Philip about specifically briefing Roland, and I wouldn't have done this without David and Trevor's okay, absolutely, but I think for us there was a question of, we're already the very act of abstracting combat into a deck of cards is already fudging reality to a point of giving you a better feel of what that experience was, even if it's not the literal truth, because the abstracted truth is not the truth. And sometimes by taking it further from because you have to abstract it, by taking it further from the literal reality, you bring it closer to the feel of that reality. I know this is getting a bit waffly, I'm sorry, but the kind of as a result, including African American troops specifically in Normandy, felt like it was an act that was more true to the wider war, even if it wasn't true to the dotting the I's and crossing the T's of these particular series of engagements, and that to exclude them and make them all white would have been less truthful in a way, even if it was more literal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does make sense.
I think it's also, the way I think about a lot of it as well is, even though it's Undaunted Normandy, it's kind of, Undaunted Western Front, it kind of represents a section of the war. We're not going to be doing every single era and every single battlefield. Historical accuracy isn't the point. We're representing arenas in the war and trying to represent all the people that were involved in those arenas in a reasonable and fair way across a period of time. So Battle of Britain is a proxy for all sorts of air confrontations, and we should represent all the people that were on the Allied side in all of those confrontations. And I think that's why also it does a great job of just reflecting the whole of that war, whereas a single battle can't do that, or a single arena can't do that. And I think it's great that we do that. And specifically to things like Stalingrad, I mean, it's also, there's a lot of truth in there, these are the real mix-ups and make-ups of those battles, and people might not want to see that all the time, but that that was the truth of the war. And I think it might not be the exact historical accuracy of that particular battle here and there and all the details, but that's not what Undaunted is, and it's not what it's ever tried to be.
All right, we are running very low on this time. So, are there any last profound words about Undaunted? This has been a really cool conversation. I'm so glad you all came together to have this with us. Rhys, since you're the real boss now. No kidding.
Well, thanks for having us. Thanks for facilitating this, Liz, and thanks. I know this is kind of difficult to get everybody here together. This is awesome to see all the people that have made this a reality. So thanks for coming, everybody.
It's been a great project to work on. I'm already working on one on my tablet right now, so keep your eyes out. Yeah.
I also just quickly want to say thanks to David for being so generous with this core idea, right? Like realizing you have a little nugget of gold there is one thing, but a lot of people would want to covet that and keep it for themselves. And I think a large part of Undaunted's success has been David's willingness to take this, what was quite a personal project for him initially, and like everything from like initially bringing in Trevor to like the amount of trust he's put in like however many generations of Osprey development teams of David or Roland has been both part of what has made the game so successful and also kind of credit to him as an individual. So that shouldn't go unremarked as well.
All right, well, I think that's where we're gonna cut it. Thanks again for all of you for coming. It was so lovely to get to chat with you all and hear some really fun, history of a historical game. So thanks so much for everybody coming out, and on to the next session. David, we got to run.